Okay, welcome to the endocrine system. The endocrine system essentially produces hormones, and hormones are something that are typically transported in the blood from one location to a farther distant site. And hormones have a lot of different functions, are incredibly important. The main things that they control are homeostasis, the growth and development, reproduction, the storage, use, and production of energy, and also they have very large influences on behavior. There are several major endocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete hormones directly into surrounding fluid. Those are the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, kidneys, and ovaries. There are also exocrine glands. These are glands that have ducts and secrete substances directly onto body surfaces or cavities. There's a few different methods of intercellular communication by molecules. The first one in this picture up here, picture A, endocrine signaling, and that is what I was just talking about, where you have a molecule that is secreted into the bloodstream and is transported down to some distant site where there are cells that will trigger a response. There is also paracrine signaling that can be done by hormones, where you have a molecule that's released by a cell and has a short distance to travel before it leads to a response. Autocrine signaling is when a cell releases a molecule that will go and bind to that same cell and cause a response. Synaptic signaling is when you have a molecule that's released by a neuron into a synapse that will then go and bind to another cell and lead to a response. And the final one is neuroendocrine signaling, and that's where you have a neuron, which in this case would be called a neurosecretory cell, that releases a substance, a chemical, into the bloodstream where it is transported down to another cell, leading to a response. So these are the different types of intercellular communication by secreted molecules. Now, one of the things that I mentioned before is that there are a couple of different players involved in the action of hormones. You have a cell that is called the secreting cell. That's the cell that releases the molecule, in this case the hormone. And that molecule is traveling to a target cell, and the important thing is that that target cell has a receptor that's specific for the secreting molecule's cell. So in this situation, on this image here, the secreting cell is releasing a molecule that's gone and bound to the target cell because it has a receptor for that molecule. But on the cell down here, it's not a target cell because there are no receptors for its molecule. Hormones can be further broken down into tropic hormones and non-tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are the hormones that stimulate the release of other hormones. And non-tropic hormones go on to directly cause a cellular process to occur. There are three general types of hormones that the body produces. Those are steroids. You can have hormones that are proteins, or polypeptides, which just means a long series of molecules that are similar to a protein, only not quite as big as a protein, and also amines. So here's another way to look at the three different types of hormones, or three different classes of hormones. You can have polypeptides or proteins, basically the same thing. These are water soluble, which means hydrophilic or water loving. An example of a water soluble polypeptide protein is insulin. You can also have lipid soluble hormones. They are hydrophobic, which means water fearing. One example of a lipid soluble hormone is cortisol, which is a steroid. And you can also have amines. Examples of amines would be epinephrine and thyroxine. We're going to talk about a couple of these. And amines can be either water soluble or lipid soluble. And if you don't know, the word soluble just means can be dissolved in. So hormones themselves differ in both their structure and their solubility. The location of the receptor can also vary depending upon what type of hormone it is. So if you look in picture figure A up here, we have a secretory cell. That's a cell that's going to release the hormone. And in this situation, it's a water-soluble hormone, which means it likes water, and it could then go and be transported in the blood downstream to some distant location where it will be released from the blood and goes and binds to a signal receptor on the target cell. So water-soluble hormones can bind to a receptor that are on the outside membrane of the target cell. That's different when it comes to lipid-soluble hormones. In a lipid-soluble hormone, those can be released and travel with a transport protein in the blood, where it can then leave the blood, travel inside a cell to the signal receptor. So lipid-soluble hormones bind to receptors that are inside the cell, whereas water-soluble hormones bind to receptors that are on the cell membrane. So the receptor location varies with hormone type. In the end, though, both of these types of hormones, the water-soluble and the lipid-soluble hormone, they both have the same action. So they are both influencing gene regulation, leading to a response inside the cell. So they both are influencing gene regulation and a response inside the cell. Hormone secretion, for the most part, is controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. A negative feedback, if you remember, is when the end product of some type of reaction or some type of process goes back after it's made to stop any more from being made. Positive feedback loops do occur, but they're less common. And in this situation, that's where you have some product, a hormonal product of some action that will stimulate the product of another hormone or more of the same hormone. Now to talk about some of the important players when it comes to hormones. The first that we'll talk about is the pituitary and hypothalamus. The pituitary here is a tiny pea-sized little gland that's suspended from the hypothalamus. And the pituitary consists of two parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. These are important because of their direct connection to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus receives information from the nervous system, and basically it's like the relay station. So it receives a bunch of information and then decides what needs to happen next through the endocrine system. So when the hypothalamus is receiving information, it will then communicate with the pituitary to have some type of action. The posterior pituitary, it stores and secretes hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus itself makes hormones, and those hormones are stored and secreted, which means given off from the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary makes and releases its own hormones, but the hypothalamus regulates it. So these are the endocrine glands that occur in the human brain. They have different types of actions. So you can have tropins or tropic hormones. If you remember, those are the hormones that stimulate the growth. They stimulate other actions, or non-tropic hormones, which go on. So tropic hormones stimulate other hormones. Non-tropic hormones have direct actions. So the posterior pituitary can release antidiuretic hormone that will have roles in the kidneys. It'll also release oxytocin that influences the muscles of the uterus, whereas some of the things that the anterior pituitary does is releases growth hormone to bones and muscles. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of these hormones in a second. So the anterior pituitary, it actually secretes 7 hormones, and these 7 hormones all have widely different actions. One of them is growth hormone. Growth hormone stimulates cell growth. Its primary target is muscle and bone. There's also thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, and it stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its hormones. Reproduction in both men and women is also under the control of the anterior pituitary, and there's a bunch of different hormones here, the gonadotropins being one of them, one set of them that are important in reproduction. The gonadotropins themselves are hormones that stimulate the ovaries and the testes. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, for the most part, the control of hormone secretion is done by a negative feedback loop, and that's not different for growth hormone. Growth hormone can be stimulated and released both from the hypothalamus and also stimulated directly through the nervous system. Often stress and exercise will stimulate the hypothalamus, causing the release of growth hormone. And deficiencies in growth hormone itself can result in dramatic changes in body shape and size. One example of that is with Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant had some characteristic features, including a long face and prominent cheekbones and chin. He also had very large hands and feet. And he had what is called acromegaly. And that is where you have growth hormone that is secreted way into adulthood, which causes uncontrollable growth. Now take a second and think what would happen if he had growth hormone that was secreted into adulthood. We would call that hypersecretion of growth hormone. What would happen if you had hyposecretion of human growth hormone? If you thought then they would not be as big, you would be correct, or be smaller because of the lack of growth hormone. The next hormone we'll talk about is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. It plays a very important role in the release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. These are steroids that help control glucose levels in the blood, and they're very critical for maintaining homeostasis. Prolactin is another hormone. This prolactin stimulates milk production in the breast. It is controlled by something called a neuroendocrine reflex, and that is where suckling will stimulate sensory fibers in the breast, which will then send nerve impulses to the hypothalamus, causing release of prolactin. Next up is the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is a gland that secretes two hormones. One is antidiuretic hormone and another is oxytocin. Oxytocin is important because it stimulates the ejection of milk from the breast after suckling. It's also critically important for causing smooth muscle contraction in the uterus during childbirth. Antidiuretic hormone is another incredibly important hormone. It increases water absorption in the kidney. This secretion is controlled by a negative feedback loop, which means as you produce antidiuretic hormone, it will come back and cause less of it to be released. So antidiuretic hormone increases water absorption, which means if you are running around and your body needs more water, antidiuretic hormone will cause more water to be absorbed by your kidneys. It is, however, inhibited by ethanol that is found in alcoholic beverages. And what that means is you could be drinking alcohol and your body could be needing more water, but it is blocking the release of antidiuretic hormone, which causes your body not to absorb as much water as it needs to, which is typically why when people drink too much, they often get dehydrated. Interestingly, another thing that inhibits the antidiuretic hormone is caffeine. The thyroid gland is another gland that's important when it comes to the endocrine system. It's a gland that's located in the neck. It's found on either side of the trachea, and it produces a bunch of different hormones. The only one I'll really mention is calcitonin, which controls blood levels of calcium. One thing that's interesting about the thyroid gland is it's got a very particular set of cells that are very characteristic of the thyroid gland. And this is what they look like. Now, the other two hormones that are produced and released by the thyroid gland are thyroxine and triiodthyronine. These do a couple of different things. They help to cause glucose to be broken down in the blood, and they also play a role in growth and development. And if you have high thyroid activity or hyperthyroidism, that can result in high metabolism. It also can result in excessive sweating and typically weight loss. You could also have hypothyroidism, and that is where you have kind of the opposite of that and typically weight gain. Parathyroid glands, they produce particularly the parathyroid hormone, which plays a very big role in calcium levels. If you have too much calcium in the blood, you can have bone loss. They can also make your bones more fragile. And the big one is kidney stones. So the parathyroid gland hormones, particularly the parathyroid hormone, play a very important role in controlling calcium levels in the blood. The pancreas produces insulin and glucagon. These hormones are very important in controlling blood glucose levels. If you think that's something I've said a few times for a bunch of different hormones today, you would be right. And I think that should tell you how important your blood glucose levels are if there's all these different hormones that help to control it. The hormones themselves, this is the pancreas here. And in the pancreas, you have particular cells that are called islets of Langerhans, and that is where the hormones are produced. Glucagon plays a role in increasing blood levels of glucose. It's directly opposite from what insulin does. So basically, if you have glycogen, which is how your body stores glucose in the liver, if you have that broken down, then you're going to have a higher blood glucose level, which will then cause glucose and glycogen, glucose to be taken in by the liver and converted into glycogen, which is how it's stored, which will increase liver glycogen. So this is a process that happens. And glucagon, the hormone, stimulates the breakdown of the liver storage of glucose in the liver cells. The homeostasis or balance of glucose is done by this pairing of insulin and glucagon. So insulin is produced in the beta cells of the pancreas and when it is released into the blood. And basically your blood glucose levels typically are around a very set level. And when that gets out of whack, there's a stimulus that says the blood glucose levels are getting too high. Let's say you just ate a bunch of pizza. So that will cause the beta cells of the pancreas to release insulin into the blood. Now, once insulin is released, the liver is going to take up the glucose and store it as glycogen. That will cause the blood glucose levels to decline. So insulin plays a role when blood glucose levels go up. That is different than glucagon. Glucagon, also, your body wants to be at a particular level, but if those levels fall, let's say you skipped a meal, then the alpha cells of the pancreas are going to release glucagon into the blood. That'll cause the liver to break down the glycogen stores and release it as glucose into the blood, causing blood glucose levels to rise. So the maintenance of glucose homeostasis is very important and is done by a pairing of the two hormones that are released by the pancreas, insulin and glucagon. Insulin, as I said before, is really important. It causes blood sugar levels to decline. So if you look at a typical non-diabetic person after eating a meal, typically within 1 hour, blood glucose levels are going to decline. That is different if you have a diabetic. After eating a meal, the blood glucose levels stay high for a longer time. Diabetes is a condition that results either from a deficiency of insulin or an inability for the tissue to recognize insulin. There are two typical forms. Type 1, or what has been called early onset diabetes, is typically caused by some type of autoimmune reaction that destroys the beta cells, which is what makes insulin in the pancreas. There's also type 2, which has been called late onset diabetes, and that's usually as a result of a reduction in the number of insulin receptors on their target cells. It is thought to be more likely to occur if if someone is obese or contributing genetic factors. The treatments for these two, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, are very different. Type 1 diabetes is treated with insulin. Type 2 diabetes is more managed by weight loss and diet and exercise, and there are some medications that can be prescribed in some situations. The last gland that I was going to mention was the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney, and there are two main parts. There's the adrenal medulla, which is the inside of the adrenal gland, and there's also the adrenal cortex, which is kind of wrapping around the outside. And both of these regions produce different hormones that are pretty important. The adrenal medulla produces stress hormones, and those are adrenaline and noradrenaline, also called epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these hormones stimulate the heart rate and breathing. They elevate glucose levels. They constrict blood vessels in the intestine and dilate blood vessels in muscles. The adrenal cortex produces three types of hormones with markedly different functions. You can have glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and sex steroids. Glucocorticoids play a role in carbohydrate metabolism, so we've got more hormones that influence glucose in the blood. And mineralocorticoids, like aldosterone, plays a role in water absorption. Now, the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those cause a bunch of things, but are typically thought to be our short-term response to stress, so that fight or flight. When your blood pressure goes up, when your breathing goes up, when your metabolic rate goes up, all of these things are, what are you going to do to get out of a problem? The adrenal cortex is more considered a long-term response to stress, so maybe you're retaining sodium, your blood volume is increasing, you're causing proteins and fats to get broken down into usable stores of energy. So the effects of stress on the body are typically mediated by the adrenal gland, both short-term and long-term. You can have some conditions that affect the function of the adrenal cortex. One is Cushing's disease, where you have high levels of cortisone. And there's another one that is Addison's disease, where the body actually breaks down its own adrenal cortex cells. And that is all I was going to say about the endocrine system.